You've arrived at Colle del Marchese, which is a little village here in rural Umbria. We're about 20 minutes from Spoleto, 10 minutes from Montefalco, and in the distance, in the far distance from one of my rooms, you can see the town of Assisi. This is a delightful and peaceful little place that I've lived in for the last 32 years. So why don't you come now, follow me, come down to my house and I'll take you for a little tour. So what you're looking at here, essentially this is a castle tower from the middle of the 13th century. I say castle is not really a castle because in Italy what we're talking about in this case would be a medieval fortified village. It would have had 6 towers, this cylindrical one, another cylindrical one up where we just came from, and then 4 more going around. So a pretty little place. Currently it's got a population of about 25 people. We bought this as a ruin in 1990. I started work on it as a restoration project in 1992 and 1993. I did nothing but work on this place. And what you're looking at on the right-hand side, you'll see the masonry of 1250 thereabouts, but on the other side, you'll see my work because I built that side of the house from the ground up and put the roof on. So it was a big job and it completely occupied me for those 2 years. So when I started asking people how old was this castle, there are no written records. This is not an important enough place to have proper written records, but people say that when they see embrasures like that, the firing slits where they fired crossbows and such like, that system, which looks like an exclamation mark, dates it to around the middle of the 13th century, which is the time of the Emperor Frederick II. So that's the basic dating system, 700-800 years ago. So come with me now and I'll show you a really, truly wonderful view. When I was shown this place back in 1990, we had a look, it was a ruin, but I took one look at this view and I thought, this is where I want to be. These are the Monti Martani, which are a subgroup of the Apennines. And if you look up on the mountain over there, you see there's a ridge with some modern buildings, and then there's another medieval village, which would have been a similar period to this one. That one's called Morcicchia, and that was my first house in Italy. And there's a bit of a story behind that because back in 1987, I was living in Berlin. Around the corner from where I was living was an agency run by an Umbrian man from this area, and he had a few houses for sale. At the time, I think I couldn't have afforded a garage in Sydney, but here was a house that I could actually buy. So I came down here in the winter of 1987. I wanted to see it without any of the beauties of summer or spring. I wanted to see it bare. I was blown away. I bought it. Then I went back to Australia. At the time, I'm working for Fairfax as an illustrator, working for the Sydney Morning Herald and the National Times. I came back to Australia to earn some money, to then come back to Italy, to live in this place, to do I did not know what, but I was determined to do it. We lived for 5 years in that house up on the mountain there, and the last 2 years were the years that I devoted to doing this restoration. And then we moved in. So I've been here, 32 years? Okay, so if you have a look at this wall here, you can still see the difference in colour of the stone of my work, which is now 30 years old, and the original work over here. Because this is the corner that I started in when this was a ruin, and it's hard to know where to start on a ruin, but I thought, well, why not start in this corner here? And I put my cement mixer there and I started to stack the stones as I pulled apart the part of the house that was there that was in the process of falling down anyway. Now, this is my very first arch, and it's such a satisfying thing. In fact, I must say that doing this, the 2 years that I spent building this project would be the most satisfying thing I've ever done in my life, because you do something and there it is, and you move in, you know every stone and it works. And anyway, in particular, making an arch, it's a wonderful thing. You begin to think, how come it wasn't discovered before it actually happened? Because it only goes back about 2,500 years. So you wonder why they didn't think of it before. It's so simple. You make a wooden structure underneath, which is the shape of the arch. You put your material on top. When it's all there together, and in this case bricks with stone, you pull the wooden thing away and it stays up. So a beautiful thing, a lovely technique, and very satisfying to do. So come inside now. I'll give you a little bit of a tour of the inside of the house. Now, this is not an exhibition house. This is a house that's actually been lived in 30 years. Children are born here and have grown up here, and we've sat by the fireplace for 30 years essentially, because this place gets very cold in winter. The last few years a bit less so, but we have had winters where the temperature went down to minus 15 degrees outside. And so I have some wonderful photographs. It's just so beautiful. This is the fireplace that I was mentioning earlier, that I spent quite a part of my life sitting beside, because as I said, it gets really cold and the best thing to do is sit by a fire, and there's nothing like a fire. No form of central heating matches having a real fire. And this room, in recent years, has become the place where the family portraits are. This is a portrait of my now 34-year-old son, who's 6 feet and covered in tattoos. You wouldn't know, looking at a sweet little infant like that it was ever going to happen. This is me nearly 30 years ago, and that's a view from the top building, looking down the little alley, the village. This is the other son when he was 4 years old. It was a while that he was a bit embarrassed by this, but he's now proud of it. But we did have a birthday party when he was about 13, and I went out and I got a fig leaf, and I attached a fig leaf to the painting to spare him embarrassment. So anyway, we've moved on from that. This, I was commissioned to do the image for the Festa of Montefalco, and I have an abiding interest in mechanical things, old motorcycles and nuts and bolts, and this is a trompe-l'oeil painting I did of my cache of nuts and bolts. When I first started to restore, the original ceiling level was a metre lower down, and I decided I wanted to raise it. At that time, it had an enormous beam, which dates probably from the 13th century, running along this wall. And I decided I wanted to raise the level and then repositioning it a metre higher up, going in another direction. I tend to boast that I did all this by myself, but on this occasion I had somebody helping me. We managed to get the thing in place. Now, we've come in on the private side. It looks as though this is a house separated from other houses, but if you come through this door, you realise we're actually in a little village. So this room was the stable. If you have a look at that wall over there, I've left a part of it uncovered, and that's because that's where the cows were tied up, and they, over who knows how many years, licked the cement off the wall for the salt. I have a photo of the cows when they were still there back in 1991. A more recent thing I've done is some of the illustrations for this book of David Marr's, Killing for Country, that came out last year. And initially he got in touch with me to do maps, because back in the early 1980s, David Marr was the young editor of the National Times and I was an artist working for them, and he'd remembered my work. And then, having done some maps, we thought, well, why not do some illustrations too? He knew I was an illustrator, so I ended up doing 25 illustrations for this book, which for me was wonderfully coming full circle, because back in the 1980s, before I'd started painting, before I taught myself how to paint, it was black and white illustration that I did. Here we have the original entrance to the house, because in older times, of course, nobody lived on the ground floor. That was reserved for animals. It was also the way the houses were warm, because if you had sheep or cows underneath, the heat from the animals would rise and warm the whole house. This was the living quarter, and that was the front door. At this point, we arrive at the top of the house, and then we have the bedroom in the top of the tower. where we have a fabulous view out over the countryside, and we look up at that village where I used to live when I first came to Italy. There you've seen it. I've taken you a tour of my house. In the last 10 years, I haven't been living here the whole year. I've been avoiding the winter by going back to Australia. I hope to continue to be able to do this. We're now in Montefalco, which is the town nearest to my place. I come here and do my shopping. Inside this building is one of the great fresco cycles of the Renaissance by an artist called Benozzo Gozzoli. And for me, one of the most extraordinary things about living in Italy is this sense that art, and in this case important major art, just grows out of the ground here. We're in a normal street in a little town, Montefalco. Have a look at this fresco from the 15th century, which is really quite extraordinary. So that many times over is this sensation I have in Italy that art here is not just a thing that's in galleries and frames and separated from you, it actually grows out of the ground.